June 9, 1944, near Vierville-sur-Mer, Normandy, France. The air still tasted of salt, cordite, and wet sand. The English Channel crashed rhythmically behind the dunes, its waves carrying the twisted remains of landing craft and scorched Sherman hulls. The gulls had returned before the dead were buried. Private First Class Daniel Red Gallagher gripped the wheel of his olive-drab GMC CCKW-2 1-2-ton truck, the deuce and a half as engineers signaled him forward. The beachhead, only 3 days old, pulsed with noise. Diesel engines chugging, bulldozers roaring, men shouting through the din. Sweet gasoline fumes mixed with the stink of burned rubber and seawater. Ahead of him, cranes wrestled wooden pallets off ships anchored offshore. Lines of DUKWs, aquatic six-wheelers bobbing like ungainly steel whales, spun through the surf, heavy with crates of ammunition and fuel drums. Red wiped the grit from his eyes with the back of a gloved hand. His convoy stretched all the way back to the waterline, dozens of trucks idling like war horses waiting to charge. "Let's move, boys. We're not parking a damn army on the sand," Staff Sergeant Louis Mercer shouted from the passenger seat of the lead truck, his voice buried under the clatter of engines. Mercury goggles hung at his neck, and a Thompson submachine gun leaned between his knees. German High Command had anticipated that any Allied landing would struggle to supply itself beyond the shoreline. They imagined a slow build-up, bottlenecked and vulnerable. They didn't imagine this. Red eased the clutch. The deuce and a half rumbled forward over hastily laid Marston matting, interlocking steel plates that turned sand and mud into roads overnight. Combat engineers guided him through a maze of supply dumps forming behind the dunes. Stacks of jerry cans, 30 cal crates, ration boxes, spare tires, medical kits, coiled barbed wire. Overhead, the sky was streaked with contrails from P-47s and Spitfires circling inland. Naval guns on distant ships thudded sullenly, their shells arcing toward German positions still tightening around Caen and Carentan. But on the ground, logistics moved like a living machine. At a ridge overlooking the beach, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Weiss of the German 352nd Infantry Division peered through field glasses. Wind ruffled the Wehrmacht map tucked under his arm. He had expected chaos, broken supply lines, stranded tanks, disorder. Instead, what he saw unsettled him to his core. Long convoys of American and British trucks, GMCs. Bedford's Dodges were snaking inland in perfect order, their paths disguised with camouflage netting and dust discipline. DUKWs waddled directly from surf to road, ferrying heavy loads the Germans assumed needed a captured port. Weiss lowered the glasses. "Sie versorgen eine ganze Armee." "Vom Strand?" he muttered, disbelief creeping into his tone. They were supplying an entire army from the beaches. Back below, Red followed a guide truck into a makeshift depot that had been a cow pasture just yesterday. Now tents, fuel bladders, and forklifts filled the field. A jeep whizzed past, antenna whipping, its driver yelling coordinates to engineers laying down yet another roadway. The real battle wasn't just being fought with bullets. It was being supplied by men like Red, steering rattling trucks past the wreckage of war, pushing deeper into France with every load. The front line couldn't move unless they did, and right now, they were moving faster than any German general believed possible. The convoy snaked inland along what yesterday had been a farmer's track barely wide enough for a cart. Now it was a graded lane of compacted earth, widened and reinforced by bulldozers and teams of engineers in dusty uniforms. Their sleeves were rolled up, shovels and picks discarded beside half-sunken jeeps and improvised signposts marked in chalk. Ammo, fuel, HQ, med. Private Gallagher downshifted as the road twisted between hedgerows that towered over the trucks like castle walls. Normandy's bocage country was a maze, roots, stone, soil, and thickets intertwined into near-impenetrable barriers. Locals had spent centuries cultivating it. Now American engineers were tearing it apart overnight. Up ahead, Staff Sergeant Mercer leaned out his window, yelling over the din to a crew of sweaty men laying down sections of perforated steel road. "Keep it straight! We got another 20 trucks behind us." An engineer gave a thumbs up, face streaked with grime. A platoon of Seabees, Navy construction battalions, hauled timber and gravel, their work punctuated by the cough of air compressors and the clank of toolboxes. A Caterpillar tractor lurched forward, carving another bypass around a blown-out stone bridge. Every hour the roads grew longer, stronger, and more complex. They didn't wait for permission. They built as they advanced. 20 miles northeast, General Oberst Friedrich Dollmann sat in a commandeered farmhouse outside St. Lo, poring over intercepted Allied signals and field reports. His staff officers argued over the expected timetable. Surely the enemy would bog down without a major port. Cherbourg was still in German hands. Le Havre and Brest were fortified. The beaches were no substitute for harbors, yet reconnaissance flights reported something that made no sense. Columns of supply vehicles stretching like veins from Omaha. Utah and Gold Beaches far faster than projected. Temporary piers, mulberries, they were called, had appeared offshore like ghosts, and were already offloading everything from Sherman tanks to mobile kitchens. Es ist nicht möglich, muttered one operations officer. They cannot sustain divisions with trucks alone. Dollmann's silence was his only reply. Back on the ground, Gallagher followed the taillights of the truck ahead as the line crested a rise. From the hilltop, he caught his first glimpse of something surreal. A sprawling dump site taking over a field of wheat. Crates were stacked like city blocks. Rows of fuel cans stretched farther than he could count. Forklifts buzzed between pyramids of 105mm shells and mortar rounds. "Unload here," Mercer shouted, signaling him into a row. Men in olive gear swarmed the flatbed before the parking brake hissed. They moved like ants, quiet, efficient, practiced. Within minutes, the truck was empty. Gallagher wiped his forehead and glanced east. The thump of artillery echoed faintly through the hedgerows, each boom a reminder that the front line was still fluid. His orders were immediate. Turn around, head back to the beach, and do it again. There was no waiting, no pause, no lull. As his truck roared back down the hill, an MP waved a jeep to a halt to let a column of DUKWs emerge from a flooded field. Their tires dripped with brackish water, hulls still wet with seawater. Each carried supplies straight from ship to inland dump without ever touching a pier. Somewhere in those hedgerows, German troops heard the distant rumble and assumed it was armor. They never imagined it was logistics, but by the time they understood, the roads would already be paved, the depots full, and the divisions ready to fight without stopping. Night fell without darkness. Searchlights on the shoreline swept the surf. Arc lamps glared over supply yards cobbled together from tarps and telegraph poles. Trucks rolled in blackout mode, but there were so many of them that the roads glimmered with the dim glow of hooded headlights and smoldering cigarettes. Private Gallagher's hands were stiff from hours behind the wheel. His deuce and a half rattled over a newly laid gravel stretch that hadn't existed that morning. The air smelled of crushed stone, diesel fumes, and distant cordite. Up ahead, a column of DUKWs crawled past like amphibious beetles, the seawater still dripping from their sides. Some carried radio masts. Others were piled high with drums of aviation fuel or crates marked Ration K. To either side of the road, engineers worked under lanterns, measuring and staking future lanes. Bulldozers growled in the dark, pushing hedgerows back with steel teeth. Sparks flickered where welders reinforced a culvert that hadn't even been on the map a week earlier. Miles east, near Caen, German infantry huddled in orchards listening to the low thunder of engines echo through the night. It was constant, never stopping, never thinning out. At a command post dug into the cellar of a farmhouse, Major Franz Jäger of the 21st Panzer Division reviewed intelligence scraps from forward observers. "Sie fahren wieder?" his adjutant asked skeptically. Moving armor and supplies overnight was considered reckless. Jäger pointed to a report. "Not tanks, trucks, thousands." He tapped the page with 2 fingers. From the beaches, a communications officer snorted in disbelief. "They must be unloading at Cherbourg." "They don't have Cherbourg," Jäger replied quietly. In London and Portsmouth, American logisticians had prepared for exactly this. They had calculated tonnage per road per hour. They had studied weather reports, soil depth, and tire pressure ratios for wet coastal farmland. They'd built replacement engines in crates ready for swap out in fields. Mechanics could lift a truck hood and change half an engine before sunrise. The Germans, still thinking in terms of ports and rail spurs, missed the point entirely. Gallagher slowed as his convoy passed a traffic control post set up at a crossroads lit by a single lantern dangling off a signboard. MPs in white armbands directed vehicles like orchestra conductors, waving some north, others west. A jeep towing a generator bounced past, followed by a wrecker, hauling a wrecked half-track with its front wheels gone. No one stopped. No one waited. Should have been chaos. Mercer muttered from the passenger side, watching a medical convoy slip by in the opposite direction. Ambulance drivers tilted their heads in silent acknowledgement as they passed. Red crosses barely visible in the dim light. The road widened ahead into a crude four-way hub where fuel trucks, ambulances, jeeps, and supply carriers intersected with an order that didn't make sense until you saw it working. Chalk arrows on boards, MPs with whistles, flags, and flashlights. Each piece shaped the flow. Beyond that hub, farther inland, temporary depots were expanding so basutu that locals woke to find acres of their fields buried under crates and canvas. By dawn, another layer of roads would lead to them. Somewhere in the dark, Oberstleutnant Weiss got his answer to the question he'd asked days earlier. A captured American map taken off a dead engineer showed sketched routes radiating like spokes not from a port, but from a beachhead. And those roads were already real. By June 14th, 5 days after Gallagher's first run inland, the fields behind Omaha and Utah Beach no longer looked like battle-scarred farmland. They had become engines of war, constant motion, constant noise, constant purpose. Every hour another convoy rolled out. Some carried artillery shells stacked in wooden crates. Others hauled jerry cans strapped in rows like metallic ribs along the truck sides. Flatbeds transported prefabricated bridges, while trailers hitched behind Dodges rattled with entrenching tools, spare boots, tarps, and radios. Nothing moved alone. At one depot set up near the ruins of a stone mill, Red parked beside rows of C-ration stacks so tall they made corridors. He could smell the mix of canned meat, biscuits, and oily cardboard even through the truck's canvas. A squad of quartermasters worked with clipboards and ink-stained sleeves, shouting inventory tallies as forklifts chugged past with pallets swinging like pendulums. Nearby, a tent hospital stretched across what had once been a grazing meadow. Medics unloaded IV kits, bandages, and morphine from a pair of vehicles that had come ashore hours earlier. Supplies that once took weeks to arrive in earlier wars were now showing up overnight. On the far side of the depot, engineers filled sandbags and stacked them around fuel dumps the size of small villages. Tankers backed into rows marked with white stakes, their faucets already hissing as men in gloves and goggles offloaded gasoline into canvas bladders nestled in shallow pits. Above it all, the rumble of artillery could be heard to the southeast, American divisions pressing against German lines around Carentan and St. Lo. The guns never quieted. They didn't have to. General Omar Bradley had issued a simple directive. No unit would pause for want of ammo or gasoline. Supply preceded combat, not the other way around. It was a doctrine the Germans had never faced, not at this scale, not with this speed. In a requisition tent lined with lanterns and cigarette smoke, a lieutenant colonel from the 29th Infantry walked in, boots still caked with mud. He slapped his helmet down and spoke over the noise. "We burned through everything we had assaulting that ridge. Thought we'd hold position until resupply tonight." A quartermaster officer barely looked up. "Your trucks left the beach an hour ago. You'll have your mortars, bandoliers, and spare barrels before sundown." Before sundown. An entire regiment's worth of gear, crossing fresh-built roads from a shoreline still under intermittent shell fire. 10 miles east, Major Yeager again sat under candlelight in the cellar command post. Reports from his scouts described American columns that didn't thin out or stagger. They simply kept arriving. He rubbed his temples. They're not fighting with what they brought. They're fighting with what they keep replacing. A younger officer pointed at a map with a pencil. "But they have no port." Yeager shook his head. "They have trucks. That seems to be enough." As dusk bled into night, Gallagher's convoy rolled past a line of Shermans parked in a muddy orchard. Mechanics were already swapping out worn treads and refueling them directly from tanker trucks. Soldiers lounged against turrets, cleaning rifles and smoking, waiting for orders to move out again. Not one of them looked like they were running low on anything. If the Germans expected pauses, gaps in the tempo, they were discovering the truth too late. American logistics didn't pause. It accelerated. June 18th. The hedgerows were still killing men, but the momentum wasn't slowing. Every time a battalion burned through its mortar rounds in some nameless orchard, another convoy arrived to replenish it. Every time a tank regiment broke its treads on granite hidden under the soil, a repair team in a flatbed truck showed up before the dust settled. Private Gallagher had begun to lose track of how many runs he'd made. 5, 7, 10. The faces at the depots blurred, but the rhythm never changed. Load, drive, unload, turn around, repeat. Even the smell of the channel and the stink of diesel on his jacket felt permanent now. On one run, he passed a column of MPs escorting German prisoners captured near Isigny. The POWs watched in bewildered silence as trucks rolled endlessly by. One of them, a Wehrmacht corporal with a bandaged arm, asked his guard in halting English, "You bring all this every day?" The MP just smirked. Every hour. 2 miles inland, along a stretch of road that had been nothing more than a muddy track when the first GIs landed, Red noticed something new. Painted signs bearing route names. Fox Red, Dog White, Texas, Maine. Road grids, designed, numbered, and organized within a week of landing. Jeeps with signal flags darted ahead to direct traffic like bees tending a hive. In Berlin, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht still debated how the Allies were sustaining their offensive. They expected problems with fuel. They assumed ammunition would dry up. They predicted delays from weather, mud, and bombed infrastructure. What they failed to predict was an army that didn't need the old infrastructure at all. At a forward observation post overlooking a valley near St. Lo, Oberstleutnant Weiss received yet another bewildering report from reconnaissance teams. The enemy was building new roads faster than the Germans could shell the old ones. He stared at the paper for a long time before speaking. They are not advancing on supply lines. They are creating supply lines as they advance. That realization struck like artillery. Nearby, a Panther crewman named Kurt Reinhardt peered through binoculars from the cover of shattered apple trees. He expected to see columns of infantry and tracked armor, targets his division could ambush. Instead, he saw trucks. Endless trucks. Some carried crates. Others towed trailers. Some were already returning empty, bouncing back toward the coast. He lowered the glasses. How many divisions do they have? His lieutenant shook his head. It's not the divisions. He pointed to the trucks. It's the fuel for them. That night, while German troops dug deeper into their positions, Gallagher watched tents rise beside fresh graded roads, fuel depots, field kitchens, medical stations, staff HQs, canvas cities emerging overnight. Lanterns flickered across the valley like stars settling on the earth. A chaplain walked past humming low hymns. An engineer company ate rations off the back of a flatbed. Someone tuned a radio that crackled with swing music broadcast from London. Artillery boomed in the distance. No one flinched. They weren't waiting for orders. They were preparing for the next push before the first one had ended. By the end of that week, Bradley's troops were no longer anchored to the sand. They were anchored to the supply lines that grew behind them like roots in Fast Forward. The Germans had prepared to fight soldiers. They weren't ready to fight an industrial engine. June 24, 1944. The clouds over Normandy hung low and gray, the kind that turned artillery smoke into haze and muffled aircraft drones into distant thunder. In the fields behind the front, American convoys moved like veins under skin, almost invisible unless you stood on a ridge and listened. Gallagher rolled past a cluster of French villagers, offering water to mechanics fixing a flat on a munitions trailer. Kids waved at the trucks as if they were a parade. Old men, caps in hand, stared at the flow of supplies with stunned reverence. They remembered the Great War, when offensives bled to a halt in weeks for want of shells or fuel. This was something new. On the other side of the bocage, deep in a camouflage command dugout near St. Lo, German generals huddled over fresh aerial reconnaissance images pinned to a wooden board. Lines of trucks appeared as tiny black blurs stretching inland from the coast. The analysts had circled them in grease pencil. General Oberst Dahlmann lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. "This is not possible," he whispered, but the words rang hollow. He had said them too many times. Another officer pointed to where a Mulberry Harbor sat offshore, its artificial breakwaters guarding block after block of floating piers and causeways. From above, it looked like a port that had always existed, but ports didn't appear in days. Not unless someone planned for it months before the first boot hit sand. Farther down the table, a logistics captain traced the supply routes inland with a ruler. They have no single artery to cut. If we shell one road, they build another. If we destroy a bridge, they ford the river with those amphibious trucks. Weiss, summoned from the front to brief the high command, stepped closer to the map. His uniform was streaked with mud. He had seen it firsthand. The medical stations filled before the wounded arrived, the ammo dumps stocked before the guns ran dry. They do not wait to see what they need, he said quietly. They bring everything before they need it. No one spoke after that. Back outside St. Lo, mortar fire thumped like a heartbeat. American infantry crawled hedgerow to hedgerow with the confidence of men who knew their next meal, their next bullet. Their next bandage was already on the way. Gallons of gasoline followed every armored thrust like shadows. In a clearing off a dirt road, Gallagher parked his truck beside others that had arrived only minutes earlier. As he stepped down from the cab, his boots sank into ruts stamped by hundreds of tires before his. He looked back toward the coast. He couldn't see the channel, but he could feel it. An invisible thread tying everything together, humming with engines and effort. Nearby, a major from First Army stood with a clipboard, pointing crews to new routes heading toward the push at St. Lo. He glanced at the trucks with a grin that came from exhaustion, not arrogance. "They'll never catch up to us," he muttered. In the fields beyond, bulldozers were already chewing new lines through the soil. By the time the Germans fully understood what was happening, the machine was already too big to choke off. They had prepared for men, tanks, and guns. They had not prepared for the roads, the fuel, the rations, the wheels, the endless wheels, and from the beaches they thought would drown an army. The Americans had built a front that didn't stop.